Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are today. Our apologies for some of the technical difficulties that we're having. You'd think after 18 months we'd all get used to how to do this stuff, but we're still learning as we go. So I hope that you're all keeping well and safe during these continued extraordinary times. My name is Dan Wong. I'm the current president of the Canadian Institute of Planners. On behalf of CIP staff and the board of directors, welcome to this important webinar on navigating race, equity, and privilege. As we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that CIP's office is located in Ottawa on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We value their ongoing stewardship of this land as well as that of all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis across Turtle Island, where we enjoy the opportunity to live, work, and study. I also wish to acknowledge that today I'm joining you from Victoria, BC, on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, as represented today by the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin really quickly. We did have a poll that we were going to try and run here to see where everybody is joining us from, and hopefully we can get that one to work. So, Kevin?
All right, I'm launching that poll right now, Dan. So everyone, if you could just take a moment to engage with the poll that's on the screen and let us know where you're joining us from today. That's great. I see a ton of responses coming in. Just about all of you have voted. And I'll just wait one more second before we close that poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that and share those results with you, Dan. So about 70% of you are joining us from the West, Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. 20% from Quebec and Ontario, 7% from out East in the Maritimes, and 3% of you are joining us from outside of the country. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much, everybody. In 2020, CIP released its EDI roadmap, which sets the foundation for a long-term commitment to what we believe will be instrumental in creating more accessible and inclusive profession and institute. As our profession has an ethical responsibility to work for the public good, CIP believes that we must be genuinely representative of the society in which we work. Our EDI roadmap provides a structured and systematic approach to embed EDI into every aspect of our organization. We provide some of the tools and understanding for all of our members and partners in order to shape more equitable and inclusive communities. As a first-generation Chinese Canadian, when my family first arrived here in the 1960s, Canada was indeed a much less diverse place, especially in the smaller towns and cities. Our first language spoken in the home was Cantonese. Although being the youngest of 3 siblings, I didn't get to learn as much before my older brother and sister went off to elementary school. Having faced a number of challenges and discrimination from both teachers and students, my parents made the decision to move my elder siblings to another school and raise us in a primarily English-speaking home so that we may better fit in to our community. As I raise our children also in a primarily English and French-speaking home, the loss of our language in our household still weighs on me. I'm slowly trying to relearn my language, but it's not as easy for this old guy. Today, we are pleased to have Shalima Cambridge with us from HRX, whom CIP has formed a strategic partnership with us to guide us on our journey of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Shalima is a coach, facilitator, and instructor, passionate about leadership, inclusion, and supporting diversity in organizations. She brings a deep understanding of complex organizations and over a decade of experience executing communication and change management strategies, developing and facilitating training, and coaching in a variety of settings. There are a number of challenging, difficult, but yet vital conversations to be had within our organization and amongst our members. We humbly ask that you open your mind and your heart, be a little vulnerable, and to both reflect and act on what you hear and discuss today in the hopes of building more diverse, equitable, and inclusive communities. Thank you for committing your time today. And with that, we are most honored to welcome to our virtual table, Shalima Chambers. Hello, Shalima.
Hi, Dan, and thank you so much for that welcome and for sharing a bit of your journey and experience here in Canada. And as we talk about race and equity and privilege, what that means to you. It's just a good tone to start off with that personal reflection. And I'm going to walk us through a bit of that as well. But just before that, I do want to acknowledge, as we go to our next slide, where I am located. And so I have the opportunity to support this work through HRX, which operates on the land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, First Nations, as well as the Musqueam Indian Band. And I'm actually located just outside of Vancouver. And so I have the privilege of joining you from the land of the Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. It's, you know, as I think about this topic and many of the other topics we talk about when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, understanding the history of the land that we're on and occupy, and being grateful for the stewardship of this land and continued stewardship is extremely important. So as we go to our next slide, I want to share just a little bit about HRX. So we do things like this, trainings and workshops, which many of you have attended previously as well. And we also support assessments and consulting in this area, which is what we've been so privileged to be able to partner with CIP on. A lot of our work is grounded in understanding the numbers. One of the sayings that I love to share is what gets measured gets done. And when we put numbers to measurement and to our goals, we can actually move the dial and know when we're moving that dial when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And as on our next slide, it just reiterates that we are in a variety of places. So we support really getting the word out around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the media. We have many different clients, both in the public, private sectors, as well as nonprofits. But research is one of the things that is really important to us to be able to continue to add to the thought leadership here. One of the things that's really important to me is to never really call ourselves experts. We're continuing to learn, and especially in this field, being open to continuous learning is extremely important. On this next slide, it just shows a little bit about where I come from and what I bring to this conversation. So my background is from Trinidad and Tobago. That top picture there of some lush tropical forests and a cityscape is actually Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. That's capital city there, and that's where my family is from. I was born and raised in the city down at the bottom right-hand corner, that's Surrey, BC. And so I really bring this kind of dual culture and understanding of my Trinidadian heritage into a land that is very multicultural, that is continuing to grow. So many people coming into a city like Surrey on a daily basis. Like many of the places within Canada, the landscape and people are changing. And so really being able to straddle this understanding of where I'm from and where I am is really important to this work that I do in EDI. So our objectives for today, we really want to start to build a common foundation, and we'll just click one more time, foundation and language to support bringing racial consciousness into your workspaces. And so some of this may be a foundational knowledge for some of you. For others, this may be added to what you currently are aware of. But really, this is to get us all on the same page and being able to bring that racial consciousness into the work that we do. On our next slide, I want to share with you some ground rules, and more so guidelines than ground rules. But what I want to share with you are these 4 aspects of how to engage, particularly with these topics. And I take these from work from Human Systems Dynamics that really looks at complex systems and how we operate in complexity. And the first is to turn judgment into curiosity. The second is to turn disagreement into shared exploration. The third is to turn defensiveness into self-reflection. And the fourth is to turn assumptions into questions. And I invite you to think about which one of these is the hardest for you, especially when we come up against challenging topics, complexity, whether it's in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space or outside of that. But which one is the one that you really need to focus on? For me, it's certainly turning assumptions into questions and focusing on that. So as we look at how we're going to approach this today, we're going to talk about some terminology and concepts, a little bit of a recap from what you may have seen in our last session, and then move into understanding the history of race and what race is. We'll then look more at racism, and then what does it look like to have an anti-racism and allyship lens to the work that you're doing. We'll also look at what kinds of questions are coming up for you as we move along. So one of the things I also want to share as we do this is that we will be using something called Jamboard, and so we'll get into what that looks like in a bit as we move along. But it's a way to get us all sharing at the same time. So as a recap, last time you would have been introduced to understanding of privilege, so really understanding the difference between advantage and power and control, and how that plays a role in privilege. These chairs really remind me of my experience with my husband, who's left-handed, and so he was consistently going into spaces that were built for right-handers, like myself. I am one of them, but did consider his needs and the needs of many other people who are left-handers around him. We also talked about the difference between equality and equity. So we looked at equality being treating everyone the same, oftentimes not considering the different perspectives, needs, or systems that are being created that could create unfair access. And then how we really need to take a lens of equity to provide fair access to power and opportunity. And this is done by understanding the systems within which we operate, the different perspectives that people have, the different experiences and needs we all have, as well as the bias that gets in the way of providing fair access as well. We also then looked at understanding diversity and the different ways in which diversity shows up in each one of us. We talked about inherent diversity, acquired diversity, thought diversity, and the experiences of privilege and marginalization that go along with this understanding of diversity. Another concept that was shared was around inclusion and understanding what does inclusion look like? Well, it looks like providing access to opportunity. It looks like showing appreciation for differences that we encounter. It looks like empowerment by creating spaces where people's voices could be heard, where people feel empowered to make decisions and be part of solutioning. So today we're going to be looking at race. When we think about building organizations and teams and the way that we work and lead that truly represent our lived experiences, this requires us to take that personal ownership and responsibility to thinking about race and the impact on what we do. And not only centering privilege within our understanding of decision making and planning, but also ensuring that currently underrepresented and people experiencing marginalizations are part of the solution process. And so we know that there's many other things we could add to that pie chart that we just saw, but race is what we're going to be focusing on today. So when we think about race, it's essentially a collection of genes and an understanding of how you look. As a human group, we define race very specifically around physical characteristics. And these are held to be inherent. So when we talked about inherent and acquired diversity, race is an inherent piece of diversity. Race has no genetic or scientific basis, and is also a social construct that we've created, mostly assigned to you by other groups. So people look at you and they assign a race to you, and it's generally something that you can't change. This is different from ethnicity, which is separate but related to the concept of race. And oftentimes, when we think about ethnicity, we're grouping people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes, such as common set of traditions, ancestry, language, history, society, or culture. Race can also be identified as something that you inherit, while as ethnicity is something that you learn. So you can think about the culture that you learn, the language that you learn, that creates who you are, how you identify when it comes to your ethnicity and culture. The concept of race arose in European imperialism and colonialization to group humans into different categories, and we'll talk a bit more about what that looks like as well. The concept was later used to establish and justify systems of power and oppression, and we'll talk again as to what that looks like. So if we can click through to the next. So for this next piece, what I'm going to do is walk you through some of the key things or key aspects of our understanding of race here in Canada. Understanding our history and our how we conceptualize race is really key, as well as some of the barriers and policies that were created specifically around race. This allows us to understand how systems of privilege and marginalization were established and why these systemic barriers continue to persist today for some racialized groups. And while we know that this persists among many different dimensions of diversity, race is certainly one that is key for us today. So I'm going to walk you through some key points in history. Certainly, these do not cover every point in history that are important, but these are some key concepts that we want to raise for you to start thinking about our understanding of race. The first is pre-contact. So this is prior to 1497. Indigenous peoples lived in North America for thousands of years before European explorers arrived in the 11th century. Europeans eventually settled in Newfoundland, and of course we know continued moving and venturing out west, and this drastically changed the lives of Indigenous habitants. We'll talk about one specific way in a little bit later, but we know there are numerous ways that this impacted and marginalized and oppressed Indigenous peoples that continue to persist to today. The next time period that I want to raise for your attention is colonization. So in Canada, this is typically referred to around the area of 1534. Western European countries set up colonies around the world for their benefit, which then exploited the local peoples as well as the lands. They exploited for goods and really for power and monetary reasons. In Canada, a French explorer named Jacques Cartier undertook 3 voyages from France. These lasted from 1534 to 1542. These voyages really serve as a symbolic start of colonization in Canada, which we know is not the only country that was colonized. This is around the world. And so what was happening in Canada was happening in other countries as well. So this period of time really starts to talk about whiteness and slavery. So first talk about our understanding of whiteness. Throughout the 1400s and 1500s, European settlers were identified according to their nationality. So they were referred to as being English or Dutch. And at this point, the concept of whiteness was really a way for upper class Europeans to separate the lower class Europeans from the Black and Indigenous populations, in hopes that this divide would reduce the likelihood of the two groups banding together to overthrow the affluent European populations. Once this categorization was established, it could then be used to other and categorize people even further. The important piece here is how once whiteness was defined, it could be used to build systems that oppressed all non-white people. It's also important to understand that while this system was created to separate whiteness or people who are white from others, this system of oppression also impacted white people who weren't of that higher socioeconomic class as well. The other piece I want to talk about at this time period, so we'll just go back one more, is slavery. And so while in Canada, we commonly associate ourselves with the proud history of the Underground Railroad, Canadians often forget that colonies that became Canada were actually home to slavery for over 200 years, up until 1834. When Britain took over New France, 7% of the colony was enslaved, 2/3 of which were Indigenous, and the other 1/3 was African. The legacies of slavery are still seen and felt today in the form of anti-Black racism, and we'll talk a bit more about this as well in a moment. So now we can move on to immigration. The Immigration Act of 1869 was passed by the Canadian government to boost growth and economic gains. The policy was highly discriminatory in practice, which attracted farmers and laborers of British, European, and American ancestry, and imposed restrictions on others. So very specifically trying to attract people that were categorized as white and not those that didn't. And really exclude people from immigrating to Canada that didn't fit the mold that they were trying to achieve. So I did say that we would talk about one other aspect of Indigenous impact or impact on Indigenous peoples here in Canada. Certainly the residential school system is something that is widely known about at this point, with the recovery of so many children in unmarked graves at residential schools throughout Canada. It's certainly a lot more top of mind for people at this time. But we do know that it was only one piece of the impact that colonization had on Indigenous groups. So keeping in mind that this is only a part of the socialization that has impacted both Indigenous peoples as well as other people in Canada and our understanding of Indigenous peoples. In 1884, the Indian residential school system was implemented by the government and churches with the goal of assimilating Indigenous children. It was estimated that over 150,000 children between the ages of 4 and 16 attended the schools, and we can probably make that number higher. And we know that in addition to being forcibly separated from their families, there are reports and documentation of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse at these schools. And now we have a lot more proof of the harm that was done to children. However, this has been shared for generations by Indigenous populations without Canada truly listening and recognizing that children died and did not come home after going to residential schools. Children were made to abandon their language, their cultural beliefs and ways of life, and any expression of Indigenous identity was harshly punished. The last residential school ended or closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. And so, when we think about this being 1996, there are survivors today. So this is not a history. This is still very much an impact in today's time as well. So this next period of time I want to talk about refers to the Chinese head tax. So Canada enacted the Chinese Immigration Act in 1885 and made almost all Chinese immigrants to pay a head tax of $50. This was later raised to $100 and then $500. And if you think about the equivalent of money at that time, that would have put a huge financial burden on Chinese immigrants. And it was really the first official legislation in Canada to exclude immigration based on ethnic origin. When the tax was removed from the Chinese Immigration Act in 1923, discrimination continued with the ban of Chinese immigration until 1947. So again, when we think about these dates that are coming up, while this is historical impact, it also is present day impact, as there's many people who would have experienced the policies that were created and imposed at that time who are still with us today. The next piece I want to talk about is relates to the Komagata Maru. And so on May 1914, the Komagata Maru steamship sailed into Vancouver carrying hundreds of South Asian immigrants. Canada denied entry to almost all the 376 passengers, and they forced the ship eventually to return to India. Immigration to Canada continued to be difficult for those from non-European countries, and this was because of something called the Continuous Passage Act of 1908. This required that all immigrants arrive directly from their point of entry with no stops in between. And again, this rule was in place until 1947. So the next period of time I want to talk about relates to the Japanese internment. One of the most tragic events in Canada's history, along with all of these other ones that I'm sharing with you, is the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. It is estimated that 22,000 people, of which 65% were Canadian born, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast to remote areas in Eastern British Columbia and elsewhere. The Canadian government seized and sold their property and imposed wartime restrictions on them until 1949. So again, a date that is still going to have people who have experienced this today. The federal government apologized for the internment of Japanese Canadians in 1988, which was over 40 years later, and did offer compensation. But when you think about the impact that this would have on a community, on peoples, on your confidence in a country that you've called your own because you also were Canadian born in many of these cases, this really is not compensation for all the impact that this had. The City of Vancouver also apologized in 2013, which now, or at that time, was over 70 years later. So the next piece I want to talk about is Demolition of Africa bill. And so I did say that I wanted to come back to anti-Black racism and another form of that and how that shows up within our understanding and interaction with race here in Canada. So in Nova Scotia, the residents of a tight-knit Black community, Africville, located on the outskirts of Halifax, were subject to systemic racism. Even though the residents paid municipal taxes, Africville was denied basic community services such as electricity, clean water, or infrastructure. As the community became entrenched in poverty due to this and due to the lack of being able to get services within the community as well, the City of Halifax began to set up undesirable developments in the community, such as a prison, a slaughterhouse, and a city dump. In 1964, the Halifax City Council evicted resistant residents of Africville with little to no compensation or consultation. Though there were protests and resistance, businesses and homes were demolished and residents were relocated into housing projects, many of which were also entrenched in poverty and slated to be demolished. These relocation efforts made in the name of community revitalization ruptured the Black community in Halifax. And today, Africville has been declared a historical site and a formal government apology has been issued to community's descendants. But again, doesn't really make up for the devastation that occurs when you really rip a community apart. Being from the West Coast of Canada, Hogan's Alley also comes to mind for me in terms that Vancouver once held a similar type of vibrant Black community. It was also demolished in the 1960s to make way for a municipal viaduct. There are current efforts being done to revitalize the area and really pay homage to the history of Black people in that area today as well. So I've just walked through some very high level ways in which Canada has developed their own interactions or our own interactions with race, an understanding of race, and how this is baked into how policies were developed based on attitudes about race, and how these attitudes and beliefs and actions had a direct impact on who experienced privileges of being in certain places, environments, locations, and who experienced marginalization due to this. This is all with power really being a central theme in decision-making, maintaining power or blocking power out of fear and out of discrimination. So this is how, racism has really been built into the fabric of our society. And if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is how racism manifests. So we think about it in 4 ways. In our last session, you would have talked about discrimination really manifesting in 4 ways. And any type of ism is going to also manifest in the same way. So we see racism manifesting as internalized racism. And when we think about, where people live, how people enjoy the spaces around them or the communities that they build, internalized racism could be not choosing to live in a particular area. Myself actually deciding that, well, I don't see people that look like me here, or I was removed from this space. And so I can see that I'm not meant to be in this space, and actually choosing not to live in a particular area or not to engage with particular services. We'll just click on the next, we'll click one more. And another area is interpersonal racism. So we can see the impact of this through unconscious bias, which was talked about last time as well. An impact on who gets into positions of power that can make decisions about how people engage with the environment around them, how cities or community areas are structured to service everyone. When we make decisions about who has that power to do that based on unconscious bias, this is going to have an impact on what the outcomes are. We also see the impact when it comes to systemic land policies and structural discrimination. So when we think about even some of the ways in which land titles have been created, we see in Richmond, located not too far away from me, land titles have included that a land cannot be sold, used, or occupied or rented by any person of Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood. So this is the actual language that was included in titles. West Vancouver also had this issue where they stated in land titles that no person of the African or Asiatic race or African or Asiatic descent, except servants of the occupier of the premises in residence, shall reside or be allowed to remain on the premises. We also see this impact as structural racism. So this is the compounding effect of perhaps land policy, decisions that destroy communities, support systems, building generational wealth, which could be a barrier to people actually creating communities where they can thrive as well, which impact amenities and services, educational outcomes, stigma and bias associated with where people grew up, or create barriers to services needed. We see this in Nova Scotia, where plots of land were handed out to Black settlers, including loyalists who fought alongside the British during the American Revolution and former slaves who sought refuge after the War of 1812. However, while white settlers were provided fertile land and deeds for that land, Black settlers were given lots of rocky, infertile soil and never given legal title. There's many people who are actually fighting to today to get land title and show their ownership, prove their ownership, even though they have families that have been living on land for several generations. What you see here is an amalgamation of many different ways in which systemic racism persists. So we see this through how we interact with the communities, but also how then this perpetuates through other areas of communities, whether it's through over-policing, whether it's through then eventual incarceration that are higher for Indigenous youth or Black youth, whether this is in being able to see leadership that represents the communities that are within a certain location. We also know that income and access to economic means has been a barrier as well due to systemic racism. In 2016, the racialized population in Canada had a 26% higher unemployment rate. Racialized men earned 78 cents for every dollar that non-racialized men earned, and this gap increases for racialized women. We also found that non-racialized immigrants do better in the Canadian labor market and do better sooner. Income inequality between racialized and non-racialized Canadians continues to extend to the second and third generations and beyond. And so when you think about the compounding impact of services, of location, of access to amenities, that's going to also be an issue when it comes to thinking about how people interact within their communities. Healthcare is certainly an impact as well that comes up. And so when we think about all of this together, no one is at this time is saying that they intend to create barriers, to intend to create barriers to access to networks, to the right people, the right amenities. However, even though that's not the intention, that is the impact of our history of racial policies, as well as our current socialization around race and our understanding of the impact of race. So what we end up seeing, and we can click through here as well. What we end up seeing is that when we go through distribution of power based on the impact of systemic racism, and we'll go to the next slide here, is that in any given system, when you have access to a minority group, whether that is providing access to voice, there should be equal say, there should be equal access, there should be equal power that is, attributed to the percentage of the group that is there. So if you had 20% of a certain minority group within an organization, within a community, you should see them at all levels within that community at that same percentage. However, that's not what we see. What we often see is this second picture here, where a minority may increase in power, or it may decrease in power in this second, or in this third scenario, where when we look at the ranks, when we look at communities, when we look at power, it is not evenly distributed across all areas. The challenge here is that when we seek to level the playing field or provide equal access, and we can go to the next slide here as well. When we look to level the playing field or provide equal access, it's not as simple as saying, okay, we're going to give everyone either the same treatment or provide a lens of equity to how we engage with folks. Because when we look at two different people, let's say person A is coming from a marginalized group and person B is coming from a group that experiences privilege, they're going to be treated differently, a lot of times based on the bias that may be baked into a system, whether that might be things like what you looked at last time in terms of confirmation bias or affinity bias or performance bias, or the person B who experiences privilege has access to systemic advantage. And so then this ends up giving them a leg up, either access to networks, to education, to the right people that maybe, or mentorship or connections that can create that systemic advantage. When we look at our understanding of race, this is not simply just an understanding of privilege, it's also an understanding of white privilege, where we maintain and defend white privilege based on our understanding of whiteness, which was developed so long ago and really developed to create barriers and create categorizations of people along economic lines as well as racial lines. So we're not only seeing this in all areas of society, we also see this in organizations and within the professions like yours. And you're not alone in seeing the impact of race in your profession. And so what we found through the EDI Insight Survey that we partnered with CAP to do is that through collection of demographic data, it confirmed the perception that the profession lacks representation in certain diversity dimensions. When compared to the 2016 Canada Census data, the profession lacks diversity in terms of race, Indigenous identity, disability, and immigration status. Among survey respondents, only 18.8% identified that they were a person of color, compared to 22.3% of Canadians. And only 1.8% of survey respondents indicated that they were Indigenous. This is relatively low considering that Indigenous peoples represent 4.9% of the population in Canada. We also saw that the rate of racial diversity increases in the younger generations of planners. So only 7% of baby boomers are people of color, while 40% of planners who are Generation Z, so born after 1994, are people of color. And so this is not unique. We're seeing this in other areas as well, that there is a lot more racial diversity as we start to see the younger generations coming into a field and within certain populations. And so part of this is to access some of that diversity, ensure that it stays within the field so that you can benefit from that as you know, we continue to move forward. What's really key here is that the more privilege you have, the more opportunity you have. And the more opportunity you have, the more responsibility you have to do something, to say something, to reflect and feel the impact that has been created through our understanding and development of race within our society right now. And so when we think about allyship and what that means, it really is about restoring equity. If we could go to the next slide here. So our next slide reminds us of that difference between equality and equity and restoring that. It's not about restoring a lack of, it's really about recognizing the impact that the systems that we've created have on the people around us. And so there's a few ways in which we can really get ourselves into that mindset of allyship. The first is by focusing on the difference between intention and impact. Allyship is not measured by intent, but it is measured by impact. And so what decisions are we making? How are we involved in policies and in planning that has an impact on people that does not match up with intention? Where we see that discrepancy between impact and intention, we have to listen to that and change it so that we can actually have an impact that matches our intention. The next is to acknowledge the wisdom of others. And so I liken this to understanding how we look through the world. So if I have my own perspective, I have my own lens through which I look at the world. That may be blue sunglasses because I have my own perspective. My colleague may have red sunglasses and see the world entirely different, experience the world entirely differently to me, based on bias, based on privilege, based on marginalization, based on discrimination, based on many different things that could be baked into our society. Now, I can't simply ask my colleague to give me their sunglasses so I can see the world, because if I put their red sunglasses onto my perspective, I'm actually going to see purple. So I need to involve others in my decision making. I cannot make decisions on behalf of others that I hope to do allyship work for without their input, without their involvement, without empowering them to be part of the decision making process. The third mindset that I want to share with you is this concept of the golden rule versus the platinum rule. So I grew up with the golden rule, treating others the way that you would like to be treated. However, we want to upgrade that to how do we treat others the way that they want to be treated, the way that they need to be treated or would like to be treated. Allyship really does consider the consequences of our actions and words, not from our perspective, but from the perspective of others. And so that's something that we need to consider as we look to the groups in which have faced traditional marginalization based on race and creating solutions that create inclusion. So I want to share with you now a framework for anti-discrimination and allyship that can help support us looking at how do we make change or how do we actually do this work of allyship. It starts with being first acknowledging, then learning, and then acting. So when we think about acknowledging, and we'll click one time to look at some of the suggestions here, we're looking at acknowledging our privilege, being aware of our bias, paying attention to the times when we may be vulnerable to bias, and acknowledging the harm that marginalized groups have endured. A key piece here is to simply sit with that acknowledgement. So often we want to jump to learning or to acting and to making a tangible change that we can say, okay, we've done this or we feel good about. However, so much of being able to do the next steps correctly is by first acknowledging harms that were done, the history of harm that was done. You know, a colleague recently talked to me about simply feeling and acknowledging the feelings that other peoples have endured based on the decisions of harm that have been made prior. And sometimes that is the required first step, is to simply sit in that acknowledgement, which means listening, believing, and creating space to hear the stories and experiences of others. The next is learning. And so this really continues our learning process. Learn about our concepts around equity, diversity, and inclusion, continue to learn about a history of race and other related histories around discrimination. And here's where we could start to learn to mitigate our biases by building a diverse network of colleagues, of friends, mentors, advisors, or coaches, and to seek feedback from them. One challenge I put out to you is to think about who you would go to when you need to get trusted advice or get a trusted opinion. You're really looking to someone that you hold in high regard. When you put down that list of people, I would say at least start with 5 people that are, you know, your top core people you would go to. How much in common do they have with you? Or is there a difference there? Is there diversity in that core group of trusted people? When you're not seeing diversity, that's where you really want to check and see, am I creating silos or echo chambers where, you know, what I'm thinking is going to be bounced back to me, or the feedback that I'm getting is not going to be as diverse or challenging as if I have a diverse group of people that I can go to. So it's how do you then add to the networks that you have, the people that you consistently trust and go to, so that there is diversity and opinion that's coming back to you in the form of feedback. The next piece is acting. And so this is where we really challenge you to use your own power to speak up, to question and challenge the status quo, create opportunities to share and relinquish power to marginalized voices. And notice there that I do have sharing, but also relinquish power. So there are going to be times where it may be challenging, but there's a call to say, okay, you know what? I recognize the privilege that I have in this situation. And so if I continue down this path, then I'm going to still perpetuate that same system that was built to exclude different groups. So how do I then remove myself to make space for other voices here to be part of this process? The last piece is really focusing on systemic change that leads to sustainable outcomes. So we're not thinking about quick fixes, but we're looking at long-term solutions that involve the voices of people that we're working to do allyship with, but are sustainable, that are things that will have an impact into the future. The other thing that I want you to consider here is what we do to create inclusive culture. So we talked earlier about what inclusion looks like. It looks like appreciation. It looks like being empowered. It looks like ensuring that people have a voice. And so when we think about inclusive cultures, we could also look at this as inclusive leaders. So every single one of you have a voice to share in the work that you do. And so how can you do that either as an inclusive leader or by building inclusive culture? And this happens in 4 ways. So we believe that humility, commitment, courage, and curiosity are key factors to creating inclusive culture. When we think about humility, we're open to feedback and being able to admit when we've done something wrong. This not only applies to individuals, but also processes. Are we creating feedback loops where we are hearing feedback from the people that we have a direct impact on? Are we creating loops where we can share back what we've learned from our process and what we've done wrong and how we will do things differently? Are we showing commitment? So commitment to our teams and the ability to address issues within a team, but also as within a system and in processes. Are we showing that we're committed to creating inclusive processes where people's voices are heard? And we're doing this on a consistent basis, not just on one-off basis. Are we being courageous? Are we accepting mistakes, acknowledging bias, and not being afraid to engage in courageous conversations? So those challenging conversations that often can be about race or other areas of marginalization, but can challenge us to see things in a different way. And not only, again, from an individual perspective, but from organizational and systemic perspectives as well. And are we interacting through curiosity, appreciating differences, encouraging new ideas, and seeking out different perspectives? Again, as an individual, but also through the systems in which we interact. And so, with all of this said, I actually want to now get us into some work where we can share back our ideas and take something from what we've started to discuss here. I love this quote: commitment is an act, not a word. And so I'm going to get you to act now as well by sharing some of your thoughts in something that is called a Jamboard. And so I'm going to, wonderful, we're getting that up and running. And so what we're going to do is share with you a link to this Jamboard. It's going to be a place where you can, that first Jamboard is shared in there, where you can enter in your thoughts. So what I'd love to hear from you, once you go to this link, you're going to actually show up anonymously, and you'll be able to use any of the icons on the left-hand side to be able to share. One of the ones that's the most easy is the sticky note icon. So it's just right underneath the arrow that is within a black circle. If you select that icon, you can type out your thoughts directly into the Jamboard. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here. So you simply select the sticky note and then type hello or note here. So I'm saving my note, and you should see that appear on the screen. Okay. So once you get in there, I'd love for you to answer this question. What role does access, appreciation, and empowerment play in your work? And where do you see this lacking or thriving? Where would you want to see being able to lean into access for the groups that you are serving? Appreciation for groups that you're serving. Has appreciation even been something that was considered as you think about the work that you're doing and the populations that you're serving? And empowerment. And specifically, empowerment may speak to voice, people being able to share their thoughts, their input into policymaking or into how they want to see their community built. And so how are you creating opportunities for that empowerment in the work that you're doing? There are several pages. So if you see at the very top, there's an arrow there that you can click through several pages. So as people share, it may get kind of busy. So you can always click to another page to share as well. So as you're thinking about that question, I'm going to pose to you one more question, and then perhaps we will open up to other questions, and then I'll pose the last one for you. But the second one, and a second Jamboard link, is going to refer to how can you focus on acknowledging, learning, and acting when you think about doing the work of allyship in relation to understanding race in your work. Where do you need to start when it comes to this work? And so you'll see the next Jamboard in there as well, link, and that Jamboard will relate to that question. So we'll give you a few moments to start thinking about those questions, and I'll check in to see if there's any questions or thoughts coming up, Kevin, around what we've just covered.
Yes, Shalima, it seems like the Jamboard application is at capacity. We have a lot of people viewing the link at the same time, which is a great thing, but unfortunately some people are now unable to access the Jamboard because the system seems to be overwhelmed and inaccessible.
Okay, so we'll just share that this can this is going to be open. So the intent of this is for you to share your thoughts, and we will share this back so we can collect some of the thinking that's coming up here, and be able to share this back to you as a takeaway document. So it doesn't have to be input right now if you're having any troubles getting in at this moment. We'll leave this open for you for the next over this next couple days even, to be able to collect your thoughts and then share this back. And what I would encourage is to have these questions or pose these questions with the groups that you are working with your colleagues, asking your colleagues, well, how are we acknowledging? How are we learning? How are we continuing to make sustainable action? And where do we need to start? Perhaps we are jumping the gun and moving into action when we haven't actually spent the time in acknowledging, in the acknowledgement space. So since there is that technical issue with this, I will share with you the last Jamboard as well, because it looks like we'll be collecting these thoughts for some time. But the last one is really focused on, well, what do you want to do now? So what is it that you are going to leave here today doing or thinking about differently? And what are you going to be taking to your colleagues to continue the conversation about race and how it impacts the work that you do? So we'll leave these as a takeaway assignment for you, but I know that having your input here is going to be really great to be able to see what your colleagues around Canada are thinking when it comes to how we're being inclusive, how we're creating spaces to continue to learn, to act mindfully, and what we're taking away from this work here today. And so I thank you for your time. And I want to check in, Kevin, to see if there's any questions or thoughts coming up that we should address as.
Yes, Shalima, the first Jamboard is still overwhelmed, but the last Jamboard seems to be functioning, and we have some folks posting in there.
Wonderful. Okay, yes, I see everything coming up on that last Jamboard. That's great. So I'll read out a couple of these for those of you who may not be able to get in yet, but we're seeing be open-minded and listen actively. Okay, although I enjoy the privilege of an older white male, I'm also gay, which has exposed me to bias, absolutely. And I can only imagine being LGBTQ2+ and part of another minority, absolutely. And this, really raises our understanding of intersectionality. Race is one aspect, but there are many other aspects to our identity, especially in Canada, which will pose barriers or systems have been built to create barriers around. And so this is a great comment to that really holds up that understanding of intersectionality and the compounding effect of the different identities that we may hold, especially where we may experience marginalization across multiple identities as well. Seeing active listening in here, trying to focus on impact over intention, remembering to talk to and engage with people who may not agree with me with an open mind and heart. Yes, absolutely. Seeking out peers and mentors with different perspectives from my own, absolutely. Sharing the concepts of inclusive culture before meetings so that they guide the conversation. What a great idea. And so I think this is exactly what this board is for, is to really take some of these ideas. Imagine opening up your meetings with setting the intention for creating an inclusive culture. How are we going to show commitment today, courage, curiosity? How are we going to show these things and exemplify them within the work that we're doing? Okay, so I'm seeing another diversifying my network with an exclamation mark. So I'm so glad that has come through. Trying to call out colleagues who make lots of assumptions and do not approach this with humility and curiosity. Yes, and so, this idea of calling out is certainly one that for some people it may be controversial or maybe hard, or maybe difficult, or we may not always feel comfortable doing that. And so I do offer for you to try and test out what this looks like. And so when I think about calling out or raising awareness when people are making assumptions or not engaging in a process through humility, curiosity, and being open, is to actually focus on calling them in as a way to combat that as well. So when we think about calling out, it might be labeling the issue that has happened, drawing their attention to the issue, but it doesn't always go the next step of teaching people what they need to be doing differently. And so when I say calling in, that's what I'm referring to, is doing that work of seeing what's happening, addressing it, and oftentimes putting a label on the action, not the person. So, okay, that is a racist assumption, and it's okay to call something, an action or behavior or way of thinking, racist, because then we understand the use of that language. The more comfortable we get with that, the easier it is to address those issues. The next step, though, is to share what has to happen differently. So what are the values that you want to uphold? That means that they may have to say something differently, behave differently, or think differently. What are the ways in which you want to create inclusion that you want to uphold? That means that they have to do things differently. What do they need to learn or change in their mindset in order to do things differently? And so this calling in step means that you have the opportunity to teach people about the bias that they may not be aware that they have, but also it gives people the benefit of the doubt that they want to do better. So it comes back to this idea of intention versus impact. If we believe that people have good intention, then we can hope that their assumptions are based on intentions that don't have the right impact. And so if they want to reconcile the impact that they're having with intention, calling them out and then calling them in to understand what they did wrong is actually going to create the right impact that they want. Asking the difficult questions and understanding how others want to be treated. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm also seeing paying attention to how we reach our communities with opportunities for engagement. How do we ensure all interests are represented? Need to go beyond what is required in legislation. Yes, so oftentimes, if we think about policy only, that can actually create barriers to our curiosity, to our creativity in providing solutions as well, and create barriers to inclusion or reaching out to engage groups that may not be listed in policy to do, or it may not be our regular procedure to engage with groups in a particular way. So it's moving outside of that legislation, moving outside of that policy to really speak up and say, okay, this is not serving the needs of everyone that we should be. And so we need to do things differently. So it's creating a different system. Learning more about the history of Canada and how it has shaped communities and access to opportunities, absolutely. Great. So I love all these things that are coming in. Hopefully we'll be able to get your thoughts into the other ones as well, but I just think that already is becoming a great repository of different thoughts and ways in which people can engage with both in a more inclusive mindset, but through the work of allyship by understanding how race has shaped our work within Canada. So yeah, thank you for that. And I'm just going to check in, Kevin, if there's any questions coming in through the chat at all that we'd want to address.
No, just mostly around access right now to the Jamboard, but I'll flag any questions that come your way.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you, Beth.
Hi, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO of CIP. I'm Beth McMahon. So thank you, Shalima. That was like, you packed so much in, and I was trying to take notes, so I know we'll get a copy of the presentation, because there was so much good information and really kind of thought-provoking information, especially because where we are in our journey at CIP right now, we're just on the cusp of releasing that Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Insight Report, which I know our members are going to find so interesting. So, I think providing a real snapshot in time of where we are and where we could be, because I think there's a lot of hope there, but also a real kind of challenge that's being put before us to really build on, you know, a lot of the content that you brought to us today about inclusion. So we're going to be releasing that report later in October. And, you know, as you started us off, you said, you know, what gets measured gets done. And I really think that that's so important about where we are right now with our EDI roadmap and what's possible for the profession. So thank you so much. Anyways, it's been great. And I think we're probably leaving with a lot of questions and just excitement about, you know, doing more. I think that's why it's so great to provide space and place for everybody to participate. So for everybody who has joined us on the call today, sorry for the technical kind of glitchiness. It is what it is. It happens, but I think all of you, I could see the engagement rates were really high throughout the whole presentation. So thanks for taking time and making space. I hope, you know, that you've taken, you know, a lot from this, and you know, if you have thoughts and feedback, Kevin will be in touch with our survey, and you know, as always, feel free to just send a note too. If you've been thinking, go onto the Jamboards, you know, contribute that way. I'm looking forward to seeing them. I wasn't able to check in, so I'm looking forward to reading it. But thank you all for being here today, and again to Shalima and Dan, thank you, and Kevin. It's been great.
Thanks, Beth, so much. And thanks everyone for your engagement too.